All right. Today's lecture, now I'll try to keep this to under 30 minutes, is on the November-December public forum topic. The United States federal government should forgive all federal student loan debt. And I want to go over a few things, one of which I would not normally go over in terms of definitions. And the first one is the federal government. All right, the federal government, as you may be aware, has three branches: the legislative branch, which is the Congress, the executive branch, which is the president, and the judicial branch, which is the courts. This is important because there was a dispute that went to the courts about whether or not Biden had the authority under certain pieces of federal legislation to forgive debt. Because Biden tried to forgive part of the debt that students have, and ultimately the Supreme Court, at least for his first proposal, said that he was not able to do that. And the reason he was not able to do that is not because the federal government, as a whole can't forgive debt, but just because the president didn't have the authority, they said, under the legislation that he was trying to forgive the debt. But if Congress passed legislation that explicitly said the federal government could forgive the debt, or ought to forgive the debt, or even is forgiving the debt, right? The Congress, could either explicitly give the president the authority to do this, or just do it in the legislation itself, and then student loan forgiveness could happen. So it's important because if the con on this topic, reads evidence that says, oh, the president doesn't have the authority to do this, that's only relevant if Congress doesn't, potentially relevant if Congress doesn't explicitly grant him the authority. So that's what the affirmative would be proposing. And then, of course, the courts would interpret that law that Congress passed that explicitly gave him the authority and said that, and would say that he has the authority to do this. The other thing I want to emphasize in the resolution is that it says all. All right. So if you go back up to the resolution, it says it should forgive all federal student loan debt. So that is, and I'll talk about that in a second, that is most of the debt that students have. That's around over 90% of the debt that students have is to the federal government. The federal government's the one that guarantees the loans that they take, provides funding for the loans. Okay, that is through the federal government, and they want to the proposal, the resolution says to forgive all of that. That's really important because occasionally you can find an article, a short article, a blog post, or somebody just kind of really saying we should forgive all the debt. But there haven't been any actual legislative proposals to forgive all of the debt, right? So that's kind of a point of a kind of weakness for the pro, that they're going to have to defend forgiving all of the debt, whereas nobody really advocates for that, and would probably kind of supercharges the con arguments that I'll talk about. The resolution, again, to go back to the resolution, right? The United States federal government should forgive all federal student loan debt. This is debated, as one-time forgiveness, right? That whatever, if this legislation were to pass this year, then all the debt people currently have would be forgiven. These proposals don't do anything about future debt, which kind of makes sense, right? Because if the proposal was to also forgive future debt, then people would just keep taking on debt, and the federal government would pay for it. And what would happen is that nobody would, everybody would just borrow money. Nobody would even pay for it, even if they're capable of doing that, because the federal government would just pay for it. The resolution kind of essentially would become about people, whether or not the federal government should pay for college, right? Which is a different topic. Now, so it makes sense to interpret it as one-time forgiveness. That's what people are talking about. The problem with interpreting it as one-time forgiveness is that it doesn't really solve a lot of the underlying issues, right? We'll talk about poverty and inequality and fairness and those types of things. Well, that's great for the people who have debt now if it all gets forgiven, and could help with those things. But what about the future? It doesn't really address any of that. And I'll talk about that a little bit as we go. Now, what is the issue, right, with student federal loan forgiveness? How much total debt is there? There's approximately $1.7 trillion is in student loan debt, and most of that is federal. You can, and some people do, take loans from, just privately on the private market, but most people take it through the federal government, which makes sense because the rates are lower, and it's guaranteed by the federal government, right? So there's not really a incentive to take much of an incentive to take a private loan. And college costs are rising, so it's very expensive. My son's in college now; the tuition is quite high, right? So it's a lot. It's a lot for people to be able to afford. So they're borrowing money to do this. And what happened is during the pandemic, the federal government actually froze payments, but now they've kind of unfrozen the payments. I think it was starting in October. You have to start paying again on your student loan. So this issue has come kind of front and center. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, there was originally a Biden proposal to forgive some student loans. He announced a plan to forgive up to $10,000 in federal student loan debt for borrowers who made less than $125,000 a year. All right, so you made less than $125,000 a year, it'd forgive up to $10,000 in federal student loans, and proposed forgiving up to $20,000 for Pell Grant recipients who also made less than $125,000. Pell Grant, in order to qualify for a Pell Grant, your family has to have a more limited income, right? So this would expand the amount of forgiveness to students or families still carrying this debt who had more limited means to begin with. In October of 2022, a federal judge in Texas struck down that plan, said Biden didn't have the authority, not that the government can't ever forgive debt, but didn't have the authority under existing legislation, because remember, the president is the one who executes the law. The president doesn't independently have the power to raise funds, to raise taxes. So you'd have to have that authority under the law. And the court, and then went all the way to the Supreme Court on a 6-3 decision, said Biden doesn't have that authority. Now, Biden did, try again to try to claim authority under the HEROES Act. The HEROES Act says that, the president could take measures similar to this under if there's a national emergency. So you look back, when was there a national emergency? 2020, 2021, due to COVID, and kind of use some of that to cancel some loans. He kind of recently issued some other cancellation under some authority that, dealt with that there were illegitimate schools that people took loans to attend. He could cancel that. So there is some limited forgiveness, but it's not as broad as what he originally wanted to do, and it's certainly not all, right? Like nobody has really said all. So look at the pro, right? What are the benefits of student loan forgiveness? Well, the first one is that it could provide an economic stimulus to the economy, right? Because now instead of people paying back their loans, they could go out and buy new cars, or they could save more for a house, right? Or buy a bigger house, or just kind of buy more things, right? More clothes, those types of things. Kind of function as an economic stimulus to the economy. Now, in order to win this argument, it's a little bit tricky because the economy's not doing that badly now, right? Some people say the economy's doing reasonably well. It's certainly debatable. But as part of this argument, the pro would need to win that the economy is not doing that well, that maybe we were headed towards a recession, and we need to stimulate the economy a bit. On the con, we'll talk about how maybe that stimulation would produce inflation, but that's kind of where we are in terms of the argument's stimulation. The second thing is, this is where we even are immediately, right, are starting to get into the arguments about this could solve the problem for current borrowers, but what about future borrowers, right? So, but it could reduce economic inequality, right? Student loan debt exacerbates this, right? Generally, people who had to take loans, for the most part, that obviously their families couldn't just afford this, right? So it's saying, in some cases it was more difficult for people to pay for school. Now now they have these loans on top of that. So it's just there's more like generational inequality that gets sustained. And if we forgave things across the board, it could help reduce that. It also may create some more social mobility in a couple different ways. One is, right, like if you don't have the loans, then you're going to be better off financially. But also, the other thing is that people may work in professions where, maybe they're social workers, teachers, their salaries aren't as high, but those empower people in the future to move, across classes, to be more social socially to take under more socially conscious work and to pursue their dreams and passions, right? If people have excessive student debt, it forces them to prioritize higher paying jobs in their careers, right, rather than their interests and talents. And you're combining that kind of with the argument that they could pursue more idealistic career paths. Having a lot of debt and being in financially difficult circumstances can certainly affect your mental health, make things stressful. It could put a financial burden, right? So you have, if you have the actual financial burden, then maybe you're not eating as well, you're not exercising, right? Because you're kind of stressed, and that stress itself can produce mental health problems. Overall, right, that this could just kind of strengthen the middle class, because the middle class is kind of stuck, right, in kind of the middle, literally, right? Like, maybe they can, they don't qualify, students in the middle class, obviously, they don't always qualify for a lot of financial aid, right? Because they're not in a very difficult financial situation, but they can't necessarily afford to pay, $50,000 to $80,000 a year for their kids to attend school. So they're kind of just stuck in the middle, right? And it's kind of hard to move on. Or if you have less means, it's hard to get into the middle class. So this would strengthen the foundations of the middle class financially. They wouldn't be stressed over all these loans, but also would allow more people to move into the middle class. Related to the jobs argument above, there's an argument about boosting entrepreneurship, right? So, earlier I talked about how people might pursue their dreams and their passions, right, with their jobs, and they may do something that's socially valuable. Well, they could also become an entrepreneur, right, because they don't have to take a job, right, for the same reason above. They don't have to take a job where they're making a certain amount of money in order to pay back this student loan. They can generally become kind of entrepreneurs and move forward that way. Another argument is it can correct a broken system. Now, it's not going to completely correct the system itself, but it's going to solve for the harms of the system, right? So the cost of college really has skyrocketed. It just keeps increasing and increasing, and arguably because the colleges know that the kids can just take the loans and are willing to take the loans. So we'll talk about that on the con. But at least this way, it's like, hey, you're saying the government really hasn't done anything to try to limit, right, the scope of these costs. And as a result of that, it's kind of they maybe bear some responsibility for the financial situation that some of the students are in, because they haven't tried to solve the problem on their own at all. It could also prevent default. A default is, in any context in which if you have a loan and you just start paying on it, that is a default. You're defaulting on your loans. But this could prevent defaults because the loan's forgiven, right? Right now we have students defaulting on their loan. That hurts the credit. Now, either it doesn't mean that the government now suddenly has more money. If currently a student defaults on the loan, the federal government's like stuck with the bill, right? Now, if they forgive all the debt, they're stuck with the bill too, so to speak. But this prevents people's individual credit from being ruined and, creating a decade or more of financial difficulty. It's also going to increase college completion rates, okay? Some people drop out of college because they're saying, well, all right, I've been taking on all this debt. I've been in school for 2 years. I don't want to keep accumulating all this debt. I don't know that I'm going to be able to get a good enough job to pay this back, so I'm going to drop out. It could potentially revitalize rural communities. Kind of for the same reason of like, well, you can do what you want. You're not under as much financial pressure. Maybe you'll go back and you'll live in your rural community, even if you're going to make less money because you don't have the student loan to repay. It could increase civic participation. A lot of times the people, they're under financial constraints. They have to take extra jobs, right? Or they're just stressed. They don't kind of engage. They don't engage in things civically. Could create an investment in future generations. And there's kind of philosophical arguments about this. We should really invest in our future generations. Our children are the future. This is what we want to do as a society. You could make a compelling moral argument here. Some people may spend, it's part of the kind of freedom to do what you want. They may make career choices and engage in more cultural enrichment. They may take some of the money that they don't have to pay for their student loans and make donations in philanthropical donations, right? They may spend more time in the community since they don't need that part-time job anymore to pay back their student loan. They may just spend more time in the community. They may make donations to community organizations. They may choose to have more children. Some people are postponing children because saying, gee, I have all this student loan debt. I can't really afford to have kids, right? Or I'm going to have fewer kids, or I'm going to wait, for longer to have kids because this is just not something I can really afford to do right now. There's arguments about national security. I think this argument is a little bit weak, but sometimes, in public forum debate, obviously in any format public of debate, you're just looking for an argument that maybe somebody can't answer. You could throw this out there, right? If people are highly stressed financially, then they may be willing to, sell a secret to a foreign government if they have access to it in order to get some funds, and, that could cause some problems. There's arguments about soft power and international influence. Obviously, issues of U.S. hegemony are always coming up. I really should give a separate talk on that, but you debated that probably before, certainly on the military presence in the Arctic topic. The argument is that, there's three forms of power in the international system. There's hard power, which, there's economic power, I'll say it this way, military power, and arguably soft power, which is a new concept, relatively new. It's from the early 1990s when Joseph Nye at Harvard published a book called Soft Power. But there's soft power and international influence. The argument is, hard power is military power. Economic power is your financial power, which obviously is critical to your military power as well. Soft power is how much how much influence you have, how much people like you. And people say, of course, these things are related to one another. So if people like you and they have soft power, they're more likely to trade with you, which is going to benefit your economy. Maybe they're likely to support your deployment of military forces, which could increase your hard power. But the argument is that if we reduce the inequality in our society, that's going to lead to more soft power and international influence. There are political benefits to this, right? It could alter, certainly alter the outcome of the election. Maybe, if Biden were able to get, say, okay, well, I finally got all the loans forgiven, got Congress to act, which people don't really even pay attention to in that much detail. Biden would get the credit. Maybe it could swing the 2024 election in favor of him. Sometimes I think politics arguments are ridiculous, but this one is probably not. And there's evidence that says that student loan forgiveness could affect the election outcome. Then just, so that's the election side. And then the political capital side, which I actually need to do a separate lecture on as well, since this is making its way into public forum debate, is that there are political, this would be divisive, right? At a minimum, the Republicans would not like this, spending, 1.5 or kind of absorbing. It's a little bit different than spending it, right? It's just that you're not, the government is not getting all its money back that it put out. But forgiving all this debt at a minimum would be very, very politically controversial, and it may undermine the prospects for things like Ukraine aid passing or our ability to get another continuing resolution. Okay, the con. What are the con arguments? So one big argument, especially for giving all debt, is that this would benefit the wealthy, right? Because, even if you, under this proposal, even if you make $1 million a year and you have student loan debt, it's going to be forgiven. Because it's forgiving all federal student loan debt, right? So this this protects wealthy people if they have some student loan debt, right? They're still paying that they can probably easily pay. It kind of indirectly, it's a program for people who are, kind of generally, okay, well, they went to college, right? They have a college degree, which increases their earning power. It doesn't do anything for people who didn't go to college, right? Who don't have a college degree, who are going to tend on the whole to be worse off financially, right? So this is a program, since it doesn't have any income restraints at all, right? This program in particular, when you're saying all debt should be forgiven, is going to benefit the wealthy. But even so, even if it had some conditions on it, right, it would still benefit the wealthy because it only deals with people who went to college. Then there's questions of inflation risk, and I think inflation's arguably a pretty strong argument against this, right? Because now people are going to start repaying their loans. That's less money they're spending into the economy. That helps kind of keep inflation under control, right? It doesn't dump money into the economy because that would be the case if people were paying now, right? And then suddenly on their student loan debt and then didn't have to pay on it anymore. So now they have money to spend elsewhere. The reality is most people for a couple of years haven't been making student loan payments, right? And because they haven't been making student loan payments, they've been spending on other parts of the economy. Now they're going to have to start giving that money back to the federal government. That's going to reduce, maybe take some money out of the economy, help keep inflation under control, right? And right now, the government, I'll do a separate lecture on inflation, but right now the government is trying to kind of keep inflation under control, right? It keeps getting back up there. They want generally a 2% inflation target, but inflation, they've been struggling to keep it there. So the argument is if you have more inflation in the economy, basically what happens is the federal government reacts to that by trying to raise interest rates a little bit more on overnight lending, which could, if interest rates rise, could hurt the economy as a whole, right? Because then it's more expensive to borrow money to purchase things like a car or, something else that you need to purchase, right? So that all becomes much more, right, problematic, right, in terms of kind of what you're trying to do. And then it could hurt the poor because as the price of goods increase, that hurts the poor the most because even when their groceries get more expensive, right, that hurts them. Things they have to buy, right? So inflation, I think, is a pretty decent argument. And of course, in the literature, there's a debate about whether or not student loan forgiveness would trigger a substantial amount of inflation. But what most people say in the kind of literature that responds to the argument says, well, even under Biden's most aggressive proposals, it's not really forgiving that much of the debt, right? It's forgiving $10,000 to $20,000 per person, basically, and said, okay, well, sure, that maybe like a little bit of inflation, but not very much. The problem is this proposal calls on for forgiving all the debt, which is definitely going to be, or arguably, I should say, inflationary, right? So a lot of the responses in the literature to inflation do not even apply. And as I mentioned, that could increase poverty. Then you have arguments about the national debt itself, right? Like, say the federal government already spent this money, but they're going to supposedly get it back, right, over time. But if they're just now suddenly not going to get it back, right, it's going to be about $1.5 trillion more dollars in debt that they're definitely responsible for. I mean, they're certainly not going to get it all back because some people are going to default on their loans, right? In the current system, some people's loans are already being forgiven. But it's probably still like well over $1 trillion that they're agreeing to keep on. If you have a lot of high debt, and I can do a separate lecture on this, that's arguably bad for the economy because the banks are always willing to lend to the federal government. When they lend more to the federal government, there's kind of like less, so to speak, that it's complicated, but there's kind of less that they have to lend on the private market, right? And so then the price of that, the interest on that could increase. The value of our dollar, could decline. That I'll talk about in a second. And maybe the government in the long term would have to raise taxes to deal with this, or they could have to cut other programs which are maybe economically beneficial. As I said, that's a separate lecture, but you can imagine one of the big arguments is this would increase the debt. It could also undermine the importance of the strength of the dollar because, as you have more inflation in the economy, right, and as you have more spending, then the value of the dollar arguably declines. And we try to protect the strength of the dollar. We want global trade to occur in dollars so we can do things like implement sanctions. And it gives us kind of a lot of geopolitical power that way. Obviously, a strong dollar can give us more soft power, which I already talked about. So a lot of debt could undermine this. There's a question of like fairness, which I already touched on a little bit at the beginning, just like, hey, some people never went to college. So it's a problem there that they're not getting equal treatment. But then also really people are paying through this for their taxes, right? So, okay, I have to pay for my kids to go to college, but now like I essentially pay for other people to go to college. Even if my kids, if my kids didn't go to college, I would have to pay. If I never went to college, I would have to pay. Essentially, I have to pay for other people to go to college. Now, it's not really that necessarily that bad, right? I mean, we pay for other kids to go to high school, right? I mean, public schools, most kids actually go to public schools, right? People pay for that. So I don't see it as that big of a deal, but there is this fairness argument. There's an argument that it would undermine personal responsibility, that people wouldn't take responsibility for paying back their loans or those types of things. There's a moral hazard argument that says, look, if the loans are forgiven, then people are just going to start borrowing a lot more money because they'll just assume that in the future the federal government will do like another round of forgiveness. Remember, I talked at the beginning about how you can't really say, oh, like, it's more than one-time forgiveness, right? That's kind of arguably not topical, but it could create this expectation of more forgiveness in the future, causing the problems. In terms of college costs, people say that this wouldn't do anything to control college costs. It would do the reverse, because now college became kind of more expensive, right? Way beyond the normal inflation. After the federal government started guaranteeing these loans, because they knew people could just take the loans. So they're just like, okay, whatever, we'll charge what we want. Now, if the loans can get forgiven, the colleges have even less incentives to control the costs. It might cause, more people, and this kind of like a difficult argument, but if more people go to college, right, it could contribute to a rural brain drain, where fewer people are, staying in rural areas and developing in rural areas, they're leaving. It's kind of the opposite of the brain drain argument I talked about earlier. It could be, politically divisive, right? I mentioned that, right? Before I talked about you could argue this on the pro, right? You could say, well, this would affect the outcome of the elections. You could also say, maybe it'll be good, but scuttle Ukraine aid, and Ukraine aid is bad. So maybe, right, that's on the pro. You could say that here on the con, you're saying the political divisiveness that it creates, it could actually cause, say, Ukraine aid not to pass, and Ukraine aid is good. Or you could say, like I said earlier, you could say, well, this will cause Biden to win the election, and Biden is actually bad. We need a Republican president, right? So there's politics effects. I don't really want to say much about these eligibility concerns, but I want to highlight, just like I did about the authority arguments, there's a lot of arguments about whether, it'd be hard to determine eligibility, exactly how much money people make and what years they made it. Maybe some other things about figuring out the forgiveness, if it's a different proposal, where the income limit should lie. But these don't apply to this argument, right? Like, these don't apply to the pro, because the pro is just saying forgive everything. So it doesn't matter what the criteria is. The only criteria is, hey, prove you have student debt, we'll forgive that. And the federal government knows how much debt you have because it's debt to them. I do think a big problem is that this could kind of have a limited impact, right? It's going to have a limited impact because it's only one shot. So this is good. It's good for the people who have the debt, and it's a big impact to them. But when pro teams are talking about solving inequality and social mobility and allowing people to pursue their passions and the dreams and creating innovation, I mean, that's all great. But if you just get if one set of people who currently has debt gets their loans forgiven, that's not going to affect even say the people who are in college now, or the people who go next year and start taking out loans, depending on, when the the loans are, even under the proposals, you usually have to have had your loans for so long. But here, it's okay, we're going to forgive everything as aggressively as we want to define any debt, even if somebody who's a college freshman who just started taking it on this year. Okay, we're going to forgive this debt, but then that's it. What about the kids who go to school next year? So it has a limited effect. And, if colleges start raising tuition and people have to take even more, and because there's this expectation that it'll get forgiven in the future and people take more loans, that could even make the situation worse. Now, of course, there's the capitalism critique. People have started arguing critiques in public forum. So I'll bring this up, right? It doesn't solve the underlying structures of capitalism. It doesn't solve, if people have a poverty contention or poverty advantage or whatever, inequality, you can say, look, the core part of this is capitalism. That's the big problem. I'll leave open the question. We're kind of even though we have critiques and all other kinds of form of public arguments in public forum now, for the most part, we've kind of held the line on you can't have an alternative, right? But if you could win as some type of argument, a justification argument, or anything like that, that the federal you could partial forgiveness is okay, right? We shouldn't forgive all loans. We should forgive the loans of people with certain income limits or things like that. That would probably be more fair. It would probably make more sense, and it would be cheaper. It would be less inflationary. And there'd be less political resistance to it. There'd still be a good amount, but less political resistance, right? There'd still be inflation, debt, all those things, but less. And it might solve the fairness and inequality arguments more. So if you can get away with arguing for an alternative, you might want to try that one. All right, thank you. I kept it to 30 minutes.